Welcome back to Jerusalem Minute here on JNS TV. My name is Josh Hasten, correspondent for JNS News. We are in the JNS Media Hub in Jerusalem, the eternal capital of the state of Israel and the Jewish people, along with Alex Traiman, CEO of JNS. Alex, how was your Passover?
Passover was nice. Good time with the family and the kids, and it's good to be back now in the saddle.
Yeah, it's been a while since we've been together in studio. A lot of news to get to on this week's edition of Jerusalem Minute. Let's start with the top story this week. According to a report by the New York Times, President Donald Trump said no to a joint U.S. Israeli attack on Iran. Israel apparently had intended to strike Iran's nuclear facilities as early as May, a plan that would have required help support from the United States. But President Trump favoring to begin with negotiations. There have already been 2 rounds of negotiations with the Iranians. What do you make of this report, number one, and why the leaks now?
Well, certainly you could see that the Trump administration is favoring negotiations at present. The question is, what's the motivations behind the negotiations? Is it because President Trump only prefers a negotiated settlement and is not prepared in any way, shape, or form to use a military strike? Is this just timing? I think for President Trump, I think he's made it very clear. You see what they're doing in Yemen right now. He's a president that's not afraid to use military force, but at the same time recognizes that a strike against Iran's nuclear facilities, unlike the strikes in Yemen, are very likely to set off a regional war. Iran would not take a military strike sitting down. And therefore, I think that President Trump is trying to demonstrate to the entire international community that he is not a warmonger, that he sees himself as a peacemaker, and he is willing to give Iran a last opportunity to negotiate their way out, to take the smart decision, and to prevent a military escalation. But does that mean that Trump is not going to be willing to use military force? If this short-term negotiations proves to be fool's gold, I think that the president is ready to use military force. I think that the visit by Netanyahu to Trump this past week, about over a week ago, demonstrated that America and Israel are now sitting on the runway with their fingers on the button, ready to have a military strike if the negotiations break down.
So critics of Prime Minister Netanyahu took that New York Times report and ran with it, criticizing him again, saying that he is not being tough on Iran, the Prime Minister Netanyahu, that is. And those who were opposed to actions he took against Iran in the past, they basically ignored those and went after the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister responded to those accusations in a statement, recorded statement that he gave to Israel, the Israeli public on TV last night. Let's listen to Prime Minister Netanyahu.
אני מחויב למנוע מאיראן נשק גרעיני. אני לא מוותר על זה, אני לא מרפה מזה, ואני לא נסוג מזה. לא מילימטר. אבל הכי משעשע זה לשמוע את הביקורות שמשמיעים כל אלה שהתנגדו לפעולות הרבות שהובלתי במהלך השנים כדי לפגוע בתוכנית הגרעין של איראן, כדי לעכב אותה. בלי הפעולות הללו, לאיראן כבר היה נשק גרעיני לפני 10 שנים. אבל רבים בחבורה הזאת שמדברים היום התנגדו באופן שיטתי לכל הפעולות שעשיתי ולמדיניות התקיפה שהובלתי. אז כנראה שאין גבול לצביעות.
So there you have the Prime Minister defending what he has done against Iran so far, saying that he's committed to preventing Iran from going nuclear. And, of course, you have the critics who are slamming him as a result of
let's talk about the leaks, and we'll work backwards on this. So, first of all, what you have is the ones that are leaking are then basically turning around and saying that the ones leaking this is Netanyahu and his camp. And they're trying to assert that Netanyahu has been the one that has always been leaking the information because really, while he talks a tough game on Iran, that he doesn't want to strike, that he's the weak link in the chain, which is fairly ironic here because he's the one that has made Iran his focus for the last 10 years. And we know even dating back to 2012 that there were leaks in the New York Times about a plan that Netanyahu had ordered the military to prepare for a secret strike against Iran's nuclear facilities. And then the strike gets leaked. And what that does is when you have these details leaked out, now all of a sudden everybody's waiting for the strike and then you have to change your plans. And so there have been people out there, at the time back in 2012 and in other cases, this was the far left in the United States leaking these plans to the press in order to try to prevent the quote-unquote warmonger Netanyahu from launching the strike against Iran. And now what you have is the opposite. You have here, within the Trump administration, you have these two camps. You have this one camp which is extremely pro-Israel. They recognize that Iran is the malign force in the region. They recognize that Iran is the head of the terror octopus behind Hezbollah, behind Hamas, behind the Houthis, that this whole entire war really goes back to Tehran. And they recognize that Iran has crossed every red line that's been put in place by previous administrations with regard to their illicit nuclear program. They understand that Iran's a bad actor and they need to be dealt with. And we just cannot let Iran cross that nuclear threshold and have a deliverable nuclear weapon. And then you have this other camp within the Trump administration, and whether that's Tulsi Gabbard, whether that's outside forces like Tucker Carlson and Alex Jones and others influencing questions about whether J.D. Vance is part of that camp or whether he's part of this like Rubio, Hegseth, Mike Huckabee camp that's the pro-Israel camp. We don't know. But they're basically trying to say that Netanyahu is the one that caused America to go to war against Iraq, that Netanyahu was the one that caused Netanyahu to go to war against Afghanistan, and Netanyahu is the one who wants to pull America into a war now against Iran. So they're trying to leak these details. And it's dangerous. And you saw in some of the details, they said that not only would there be airstrikes against some of these facilities, but there would also be commando raids on some of the facilities. And this can put the Israeli soldiers into great danger if details of these plans get leaked in advance. Where previously maybe Iran's defenses were down and they weren't preparing for commando raids. Guess what? Now Iran's going to be preparing for commando raids on these facilities, which again could put the lives of Israeli soldiers into risk. And it makes Israel pause and think twice about whether those plans, if those actually were the real plans, it makes Israel think twice about whether they can do those plans. At the same time, you have to wonder, are these leaks legitimate at all? Is this just somebody making some stuff up and saying this is what Israel wants to do, only for the purpose of making Netanyahu look bad? But I think, and this was my takeaway, both from being in the Oval Office for over an hour with Netanyahu and President Trump during their recent meetings, and in talking to some of the members of the Prime Minister's inner circle after the meetings, that these two administrations really are on the same page. So there's a lot of noise going on, and there was reports that I read today stating that the relations between the two administrations, Netanyahu administration and the Trump administration, are all-time lows, and that Netanyahu's relationship with Trump now is even worse than it was with the Biden administration, which would be hard to believe. But people are trying to say that. They're trying to make it look like there's a big rift. They're trying to make it, in fact, that Trump will get angry at Netanyahu. But it's my understanding that the relationship between these two leaders is strong, that there is a plan. The plan is to allow some short-term effort and negotiation to take place, but that this negotiation does not have an endless window of time here, and that negotiations for the peaceful dismantlement of the Iranian nuclear program can only happen when there is a very viable and credible nuclear threat at the back of it. And the two leaders, I believe, have made it very clear that they are establishing that credible military threat.
Yeah, so the U.S. has met with the Iranians twice over the last 2 weeks, once in Oman and now yesterday in Rome. And according to reports, Iran put together its own proposal on its nuclear program. It's a three-phase proposal. According to the reports, Iran would temporarily reduce uranium enrichment. There would be a permanent end to high-level enrichment, and Iran would transfer its highly enriched uranium stockpile to a third country. Apparently, according to the reports, and Steve Witkoff, who's there representing the Americans, things are moving forward, but it's really hard to say. We don't have exact details. That being said, President Trump on Friday did say Iran, at the end of the day, cannot have nuclear weapons. Let's jump to that clip.
They can't have a nuclear weapon, and if they have a nuclear weapon, you'll all be very unhappy. You'll all be very unhappy.
Have you spoken with Xi? Who is leading
your
those
life
trade
will be in
talks?
great danger. Yeah.
So there you have President Donald Trump, similar to comments he made in the past, giving Iran an opportunity to negotiate, But at the end of the day, and I don't know what his time frame is, if Iran is not compliant, if he doesn't think things are going well, then President Trump says Iran potentially alluding to the fact that there will be a U.S. strike or a U.S. Israel strike on the Iranians.
The problem here is that Iran is not a faithful actor when it comes to negotiations. They're obviously using any attempt at negotiation, first of all, to determine what America's weaknesses might be, what Steve Witkoff's weaknesses might be. The Iranians are experts in negotiating behavior. And they know who they're dealing with, and they are most definitely trying to stall for time. I mean, that's clear. You know, they will try to drag out the negotiation process as long as possible. And it doesn't mean that they know what their end is as of yet, but they're going to be testing the patience of the Trump administration. I think we can be already clear that they've already fully tested the patience of Netanyahu's administration. I do think that if the choice was Netanyahu's alone, that they would already strike, but I do think that we're on a pathway towards some kind of military strike here as these negotiations break down, which is what I predict is going to happen, even though I'm in no way, shape, or form on the inside of these negotiations or a prophet. But strong likelihood that these negotiations will break down. And I think that there is a very strong likelihood that you're going to see a nuclear strike at some point. The president has already said that Israel would be the one to take the lead on that. I believe that we should have some fair degree of certainty that Israel knows where these nuclear facilities are. They know how to take them out. You know, they have prepared the battle plans for this strike. It's a question of to what degree of assistance they will need or will get, even if they don't need from the United States. And then, of course, is being ready for the contingencies. What happens on the moment after Israel launches a strike? Are they prepared to deal with the influx of ballistic missiles that Iran is likely to send towards Israel's way? And then for other countries in the region that Iran has threatened to strike if the United States will be involved in some kind of a nuclear attack.
Israel successful in taking out the Iraqi nuclear reactor, also taking out the Syrian nuclear reactor, which was being built, I think, back in 2009. So hopefully there's a plan in place in order to prevent Iran from going nuclear, and that's the bottom line.
And it's interesting to watch Steve Witkoff here again, right? This is the special envoy that was sent to negotiate the release of hostages. So he's dealing with the Qataris and the Egyptians and Israel and Hamas with regard to getting the hostages out. We've seen that Witkoff has already gone to meet Putin, I believe, on more than one occasion. And Witkoff is the man leading the negotiations with the Iranians as well, first in Oman and now in Rome. So the master negotiator, and we'll have to see if Steve Witkoff is up to the task. I mean, there's still questions that remain about his viability as a negotiator. Certainly, the war still rages between Russia and Ukraine. Certainly, there are hostages still remaining in captivity, and we don't know how Witkoff will fare in the negotiations with the Iranians, who have been prepared for this moment, I believe, even longer than Steve Witkoff.
No doubt about that. At the same time, last night in Prime Minister Netanyahu's recorded comments, he touched on the situation in Gaza, of course, as the war still rages down there. Prime Minister Netanyahu saying there will be no end to the war until Hamas is removed from power and all the hostages are released. Let's check out the comments from Prime Minister Netanyahu.
לא נסיים את מלחמת התקומה לפני שנשמיד את החמאס בעזה, לפני שנחזיר את כל חטופינו, ולפני שנבטיח שרצועת עזה לא תהווה עוד איום על ישראל.
So there you have Prime Minister Netanyahu discussing the fact that the war can only end when Hamas is no longer a threat to the state of Israel. He also went after critics who are criticizing his policies, accusing the Prime Minister of all sorts of shenanigans and some sort of plan in which he would agree to a ceasefire, the hostages would be released, and then he would go ahead and break the ceasefire and strike. He says that absolutely, he said that is absolutely false. He's not pulling any tricks here. He's an honest negotiator and will respect any deal that is reached. But the main point here is that the war will not end until Hamas is no longer in power, no longer a threat to the state of Israel.
Well, I don't think Netanyahu should commit to anything, quite frankly, and he should use whatever tools necessary, including deception, in order to get back the hostages, if that's what he needs to do. If you say the deal is that, okay, we'll cease fire and then we get back all the hostages, I would actually support Netanyahu breaking such a ceasefire. We've seen over and over again that Hamas breaks its ceasefires. It violates all ceasefires, and they operate out of hospitals, mosques, out of civilian homes, schools. They're not honest brokers. So when you're dealing with an honest broker, then you deal honestly with an honest broker. When you're dealing with a dishonest broker, you can use the same tactics that they would use against you in a war against them.
So you think that was the wrong message he sent last night?
Look, it's not necessarily the wrong message, because even if I had the view that I just espoused, I would probably say that I would adhere to any kind of a deal. I just think you got to keep your enemy guessing. But it really is interesting when you see the protests in Israel now against Netanyahu. And let's be clear about it. These are anti-Netanyahu protests. These are the same people that have been organizing the protests during the consecutive election cycles that we had. These are the same people that have been organizing the protests against the proposed judicial reforms, which would have taken away authority from an overreaching activist high court, which basically cancels legislation and cancels the executive authority of the prime minister's office. And they are now saying, end the war. Right? They say, do whatever you need to do to bring back all the hostages now, as if Netanyahu is the one holding the hostages in his basement, stop the war and get all the hostages out. But you're dealing with the terrorist organization that's holding the hostages. And again, it's the same thing with the negotiations with Iran. The only way you're going to get Hamas to release the remaining hostages is if they think they have something to lose by continuing to hold on to those hostages, right? So it's only with the threat of a credible military force that you're going to get the hostages back. At the same time, what's Hamas trying to play for? The same way the Iranians are trying to play for time in the negotiations, Hamas is also trying to play for time. Every day that they remain in power is a day that they believe that they're closer to staying in power for the long haul. So what they want out of the release of any hostages is an extended ceasefire, because they think every day you cease fire is another day that they live to survive and to tell about it, and the chances of them staying in power long term only go up. But what you have here is the Israelis protesting for the return of the hostages are now simultaneously posting for an end to the war. And what do they say? They say, bring back the hostages now. Akshav, bring them back now. So we know that there's a movement in Israel called Shalom Akshav, peace now. This is a far left activists in Israel that want to see Hamas stay in power. And why do they want to see Hamas stay in power? And the reason is because they believe that Netanyahu represents a greater threat to Israel than Hamas does. Why does Netanyahu represent a greater threat? First of all, because they can't defeat him at the ballot box, right? We had 5 consecutive elections. They couldn't get Netanyahu out. The people continue to want Netanyahu over any of the other leaders that the left is presenting, not to mention over the ideology that the left is presenting. I mean, if it was up to the left wing, they would go back to October 6th. They would keep Hamas in power. They would say, well, maybe we can't keep Hamas. Let's bring back the Palestinian Authority like we did in 2005. Let's just, the problem is we didn't finish the job. We only pulled out of Gaza. We didn't pull out of Judea and Samaria. Let's just make a 2-state solution, and then we'll be all out of wars forever, right? Peace now. Let's have peace now, because they don't understand the reality that we're dealing with here in the Middle East. And the last thing that these people want is for Netanyahu to defeat Hamas. The last thing that they want is for Netanyahu to successfully strike at Iran's nuclear facilities, because these would be victories for Netanyahu, and they would ground his electoral support even further. So they don't want the hostages back. They don't want the Hamas to be thrown out of Gaza. They don't want the Gazan citizens to leave Gaza, and they don't want Netanyahu to successfully take out Iran. And this is what we're dealing with. This is from inside the country. So when you see these bring them home slogans being stated, and you see these protests all about the hostages, saying Netanyahu doesn't care about the hostages, I think a good argument can be made that Netanyahu has lost a lot of momentum in this war because he has placed the hostages at the front of his policy commitment. If he did not place the hostages so highly on his agenda, and he's always talking about the hostages, I can tell you that Netanyahu is talking about the hostages more than the Trump administration is talking about them. Netanyahu has made it his primary priority to get the hostages back, and to the detriment of the war effort, I would say. So this is the balance that Netanyahu has had, and we're now like fighting the war on the slow burn. I mean, there's definitely airstrikes that are taking place. There's a methodical drive now to sort of divide the strip and by various corridors. We've seen that Israel has created this new Morag corridor to separate Rafah off from the rest of the Gaza Strip. But you're not seeing the type of full force military campaign inside Gaza that Israel's capable of doing if they really want to get Hamas out of power.
So first of all, in regard to the protesters, this week they've turned their attention to Minister of Strategic Affairs Ron Dermer protesting outside his house. He's also the one leading those negotiations in terms of trying to get the hostages home. At the same time, Hamas has officially rejected Israel's latest proposal, which would have seen 10 living Israeli hostages and the bodies of 16 others returned to Israel. Let's check out Prime Minister Netanyahu's remarks on Hamas's rejection of the latest offer.
בסוף השבוע הזה, החמאס שוב דחה הצעה שהייתה יכולה להביא לשחרור מחצית מהחטופים החיים שעדיין מצויים בעזה ולהשבת חללים רבים. החמאס דורש את סיום המלחמה והותרת שלטונו על כנו. הוא דורש גם נסיגה ישראלית מוחלטת מעזה ושיקום עזה עם הכנסת הון עתק שיאפשר לו להתחמש מחדש ולהכין שוב מתקפות עלינו. סיום המלחמה בתנאי כניעה אלה יעביר מסר לכל אויבי ישראל שבאמצעות חטיפת ישראלים ניתן להוריד את מדינת ישראל על ברכיה.
So no surprise, really, Hamas essentially rejecting every single offer throughout the past negotiations over the last several months. And at the same time, you mentioned the protesters turning their attention to another member of the inner cabinet there, making his life miserable outside his house.
Yeah, and I don't even understand negotiating for the return of half of the living hostages, right? If I'm Israel, I'm demanding every single last hostage out now or else. But you see that this is what Israel thinks that they can possibly get, is only some kind of deal where Hamas still gets to hold on to some hostages. Israel even willing to go as far as to get back only 10 because they believe that getting back 10 is better than getting back none. If Hamas wanted to release the hostages would be home. Okay, they want to hold the hostages. This is the reason why they took the hostages to begin with. This is the only card that they have. And you see now the protest movement protesting like outside, Minister Dermer's house. Minister Dermer's not even there. Like he's negotiating in Qatar. He's negotiating elsewhere. He's running around. He's in the war cabinet. First of all, he's working night and day for the release of these hostages and for continuing the war effort. He's a member of the war cabinet. And so who's being affected? I mean, his wife, his kids, Ron has 5 kids at home. They can't even move inside and outside of their house. This isn't even a peace, what you call freedom of speech. This isn't peaceful protest. This is harassment. Okay. There were 5 people arrested outside Ron Dermer's house just over a week ago. They are harassing him. They are harassing his family as if he's not working hard, for the Israeli people. They say 59 are resigned. Bring back all 59 hostages. Of course, we understand that probably only about 22 to 24 of the hostages are still alive. The rest are dead. So when they say 59 are resigned, there's not even 59 live hostages to bring back home, even though, of course, we do want to get the bodies back. I mean, that is a secondary priority, of course. But I think, they try to make it like it's Dermer's the one responsible for these 59 people. I would say the opposite. I say Dermer is responsible for 10 million people. He has the weight of the future of this country on his shoulders, together with the prime minister. I think he's doing everything in his power to try to steer this war wisely, which means negotiating against all the domestic concerns, negotiating against the international community, negotiating first with the Biden administration, now through a friendlier Trump administration, dealing with the military at the same time. There are a lot of components of this war, and it's a multi-front war. Ron Dermer's been one of the heroes at the front of the war effort for the state of Israel, and it's just unfortunate that those people that just hate Netanyahu so badly that they're willing to use these hostage families cruelly. They're cruelly using these hostage families as the hook, the trigger for their latest round of protests. Believe me, If the hostages will all come home tomorrow, these same people that are protesting for an end to the war now and are protesting for the hostages to come home, they're going to be protesting for something else. This protest movement's not going away, but it's just unfortunate that the Israeli police and the court system just allow the harassment of ministers during this process when believe me, Ron Dermer doesn't need this job, okay? He could make a lot of money in the private sector, and I'm sure they prefer that, by the way.
Sure.
But, just doing what he's doing out of the goodness of his soul, really, believing that you have to put the nation of Israel first before any personal ambitions, using his talents for the state of Israel, for the Jewish people, and this is the reward that he gets.
At the same time, no surprise out of Hamas, the evil, maniacal terrorist organization, over the weekend releasing another hostage propaganda video. In this one, you have hostage Elkanah Botbot. Third time they've produced footage of him. He's been held captive for over 560, 70 days. In the video, you had Botbot addressing his family in a mock phone call. Just more Hamas propaganda. And just very, very sick. And that's who they are. And there's no surprise why they're rejecting every negotiation. They want to keep the hostages, as you said, in Gaza. They want to keep them in the hellhole, in the dungeons, in their control. And at the same time, trying to get into the Israeli psyche by releasing these sick videos.
And I want to make one last point about the domestic protests, like in favor of dropping everything to get the hostages back. What do you think that does to Hamas? I mean, first of all, it encourages them to continue holding on to the hostages, and it drives up the price of the hostages, okay? When you're protesting against your own side, telling your own side, give the terrorists whatever they want in order to get back the hostages, what do you think that does? That just hardens Hamas's negotiating position. So you see that as Netanyahu has said, they are basically doing Hamas's propaganda work for them, okay? And they're driving up the price, and they're making it much more difficult to bring the hostages back. And that's why you have to wonder if the hostage movement actually wants the hostages back at all, or have they latched onto this issue simply because they think that Netanyahu will be unsuccessful in bringing back the hostages. And then at the same time, through their own actions, they just drive up the price, make it harder to get the hostages back home so that they can turn around just day after day after day and say, you are failing to bring the hostages home. It's a perfect flywheel circle for them to link their anti-Netanyahu protests to this hostage movement. And I feel the worst for the families. The families are just suffering so badly.
Terrible.
They're with their loved ones in captivity, and to see them being used by this anti-Netanyahu movement. And that's not to say, by the way, that a lot of them weren't anti-Netanyahu to begin with. I mean, if you just look at the geography of where October 7th took place and a lot of these kibbutzim, these are left-wing kibbutzim movements. The people that were kidnapped from these communities were not Netanyahu voters. So it's very easy for them to jump on board with the anti-Netanyahu movement that pivoted to take on their cause and to set up the hostage square. But these families are being used, and it's a double crime, honestly. I think it's terrible, but they're just making it harder and harder for Hamas to release the hostages. And you see with the release of these videos that they're just playing into the propaganda games.
Sticking with Hamas here, a question was asked this week, what is the situation within the terrorist organization? There was a Wall Street Journal report indicating that Hamas is in severe financial crisis. Israel's military campaign against Hamas has triggered a major financial crisis for the terrorist group, which is now struggling to pay its own gunmen, its own terrorists, according to this report. Question is, what are the ramifications of a Hamas which is suffering financially? What does it mean for us here in Israel?
Well, I think that's super important. I mean, the last thing you want is Hamas to have the money to continue its rule. And, you saw just a couple of weeks ago that there were the beginnings of some protests against Hamas inside the Gaza Strip. Now, that's a movement that you would expect would gain groundswell and would gain momentum. We're not seeing too many reports about additional protests, but believe me, if Hamas can no longer pay off its own membership, people are going to see that the Hamas is finished, right? So, bleeding Hamas of money is extraordinarily important. You see the economic war is just as important as the military war. And also important to note that Israel has been withholding humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip for many, many weeks. And this is only made possible by the Trump administration, because for the Biden administration, the only thing that they cared about from day one was humanitarian aid every day. Israel's not doing enough to let humanitarian aid into the Strip. These were the words of Antony Blinken of the Biden administration. With the Trump administration, it's obviously a different regime. It's a different concept. As far as the Trump administration is concerned, Israel has a green light to do whatever they want in Gaza. They don't need to put humanitarian aid into the Strip. They can bleed Hamas dry. They can attack Hamas as hard as they want. It's only because Israel cares so deeply about the hostages that they're not going full force now against Hamas in Gaza. But we have to see what happens because economic pressure and the pressure of humanitarian aid, that takes time. It takes time. But I think if we see that Hamas really doesn't have the goods to hand out anymore, whether that's humanitarian aid, whether that they hijack, whether that's money, that you're going to start to see the Gazan people get more and more restless. And this brings us to the next and most important point, which is, are the Gazans actually going to be able to leave? You know, this is what Netanyahu spoke about inside the Oval Office with President Trump, saying that those that want to leave, and he keeps referring to this as the Trump plan, that Trump is willing to allow the resettlement of Gazans outside of the Strip. But we haven't seen it happen yet, and we need to see a breakthrough in this regard. And the question is, you know, which country is going to, or countries are going to be willing to accept Gazans? We haven't really seen the answer to that question yet. And we wonder, you know, how this war is going to play itself out. You know, with definitely Israel moving forward with the yellow light. You know, they're not pushing the bar too strongly with regard to getting Hamas finally out of power, with regard to getting Gazans to leave the Strip if that's what they want to do. And it's hard to know how Israel's going to pick up the momentum on this, but we're definitely waiting to see this momentum pick.
It is a yellow light, but the war is certainly happening. It's certainly being carried out in Gaza. I mean, I hear the booms even where I live in Gush Etzion. You can hear the booms when Israel strikes in northern Gaza. And unfortunately, an Israeli soldier, a Bedouin tracker, 35-year-old Bedouin tracker, was killed in Gaza, in northern Gaza, over the weekend. This was the first Israeli military death in Gaza since March the 18th. So war still goes on. From what I understand, the reports indicate there was some sort of ambush in which this soldier's position was attacked, and then other soldiers came to help, and there were 3 or 4 others seriously wounded. So unfortunately, another soldier was
It's really tragic. It's really tragic, and war is dangerous. And the Gaza Strip is booby-trapped, and Hamas continues to consolidate its ranks inside the Gaza Strip and to reorganize and to find weapons that were left behind in various places. And they definitely pose a threat to the IDF, and soldiers have been moving in and out, and it's dangerous. It's dangerous. And I think that it's really important that we remember the soldiers. And you've had hundreds of soldiers that have died, you know, fighting this war so far. And the hostages' lives are important, and they're critically important, but they're not more important than the lives of soldiers, right? And if you are slowing down, and if you're putting soldiers' lives at risk because you're not fighting the war the way you should be fighting the war, you have to make that calculation, right? Whose life is worth more? Is a hostage's life worth more than a soldier's life? I don't think that's not a choice that I would want to be faced with as an Israeli leader. It's certainly not a choice that those protesting in favor of the stopping the war and getting the hostages back, you know, are making. You know, when they talk about giving Hamas whatever they want, they're talking about releasing thousands, if not, you know, thousands of terrorists, many with blood on their hands, many that are known active committers of first-degree murder that would do it again. And would allow Hamas to, as the Prime Minister says, to regroup, to rearm, and to figure out how to conduct the next October 7th attack on Israel. So on the one hand, yeah, of course you want to get back as many hostages as you can as soon as possible. We want all of the hostages, every single last remaining living hostage, every last remaining body of a dead hostage back for a proper burial as soon as possible. But you have to understand that there is a cost here of other lives. We see a soldier was just killed. Hundreds of soldiers have been killed, you know, fighting this war against Hamas. And if you let known terrorists back out into the streets in order to get the hostages back, you're basically kicking the can down the road until the next Israelis, God forbid, will be killed by these terrorists. So you have to weigh all of this together when you're fighting this war.
Absolutely. I want to turn to diplomacy now. A spat this week between France and Israel. You had French President Emmanuel Macron saying that Israel has a right to defend itself, but within proportion. At the same time, you had the French president saying that France could recognize a Palestinian state, so-called, as early as June. Well, Prime Minister Netanyahu's son, Yair Netanyahu, didn't subscribe, to put it mildly, to President Macron's views, lashing out on Twitter or X, saying, quote, "Screw you," okay? And then listing all of these other territories and provinces which France controls in their so-called occupations over these areas. At the same time, you had Prime Minister Netanyahu taking to the phone, speaking to the French premier, telling him that a two-state solution would be a huge reward for terrorism. And then Macron doubled down on a Palestinian state. So back and forth diplomacy there, some of it not really PC, especially out of Yair Netanyahu. But Emmanuel Macron obviously is still in this October 6th mentality, not recognizing that creating a so-called Palestinian state would essentially be a reward for Hamas and their brutal massacre on October the 7th.
Yeah, I don't know if Emmanuel Macron got the memo that President Trump won the election in the United States, and the president has a very different view on what needs to be the outcome here in the Middle East than the previous Biden administration, whoever was running that show, whether it was Secretary of State Antony Blinken, or others, that when the previous administration was in power, they were the ones saying, there needs to be a pathway toward a two-state solution. They were the ones saying, Israel can defend itself, but how it does so matters. And now you're seeing that those lines are now shifting because they're not coming out of Washington anymore. Now they're coming out of Western Europe, Emmanuel Macron, but Macron does not have the same weight that the president of the United States has, especially for Israel, right? You wouldn't have seen Yair Netanyahu telling Blinken to screw you the way he was willing to tell Macron screw you, and calling for independent Corsica, independent French Polynesia. And then you saw Netanyahu getting into it right back on X, saying, I don't really agree with my son's choice of language on this. I wouldn't have said screw you, but he's right, and the prime minister went on in one of his remarks to state that his policy is to oppose the creation of a Palestinian state. He says that's been his policy for a long time, which is certainly not what he said in 2009 when he first came into office, when Barack Obama was in power, and he talked a little bit about the pathway toward potential Palestinian statehood, even though the prime minister always believed in what he would call a state minus, as opposed to like a full state. But certainly after October 7th, you're not going to see Prime Minister Netanyahu allowing for the creation of a Palestinian state as a reward to the terrorism that took place on October 7th. And that was the question that I asked the president in the Oval Office. I said, was October 7th the death blow of the two-state solution? And then I also asked him if the United States would be willing to classify the Palestinian Authority as a terrorist organization for their continued pay-for-slay terror financing payments to terrorists and the families of terrorists, right? And so we have to see now if the dial is going to be moved. We haven't yet heard the President of the United States make his policy known on the future of Palestinian statehood. I think we would like to hear that. Back in February, the president said that he would make remarks about the future status of Judea and Samaria. We have yet to hear those statements. But meanwhile, sad statements, I think, coming from Emmanuel Macron, just goes to show you that the international community has not shifted its thinking yet. And they think that that October 7th was an outgrowth of Israeli policy toward the Palestinians, as opposed to just decades and decades of Palestinian incitement against Jews, incitement that it's going to take, honestly, decades, if not generations, to correct.
Switching gears here, and we had the privilege of seeing him this morning in the JNS studio here at the JNS Media Hub. Ambassador to Israel, U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, who just arrived in the country several days ago. He's officially now the ambassador. He went to the Western Wall, the Kotel, on Friday, and he delivered this message to JNS. He said, people sometimes only think that Israel benefits from the United States. So the truth is the U.S. benefits a great deal from Israel. And I think that's a very important message that he sent. It was an honor and a pleasure to see him for a few minutes this morning here in studio. And the clip of that, I guess, will come out shortly. But it's great to have such a pro-Israel friend here on the ground, pro-Judea and Samaria, Israel's biblical, historic heartland. And I think we're just going to see great things from the ambassador as he begins his term as the new U.S. ambassador to Israel.
Yeah, first of all, very impressive that Mike Huckabee's first act as ambassador, even before, and by the way, even he was here this morning, he has not yet even given his credentials to Israeli President Isaac Herzog. That ceremony is going to take place tomorrow. So he landed in the country on Thursday, and then Friday morning as his first act, I don't even think he got a good full night's sleep here in Jerusalem. He was at the Western Wall, and what was he doing there? He was placing a note that was handwritten by the President of the United States, which he received last week. And the President told him, he said, please, the first thing I want you to do when you get to Israel is to deliver this letter, which called for the peace of Jerusalem, and place it inside the stones of the ancient Western Wall. And Huckabee noted when he was doing that President Trump was the only U.S. president to ever have visited the Western Wall. And what you could see, and then afterwards, by the way, Huckabee did a press briefing, from the Western Wall Plaza, and I think you get to see that this is a man who's transparent. He wears his views on his sleeve. He is kind. He is decent. He is thoughtful. He cares about the United States of America. He understands what it means to be an ambassador, meaning that it's the president's strategies, the president's policies. He called himself more of a pharmacist than a chemist, meaning he doesn't come up with the policies. The policy prescriptions are written for him, and then he fulfills them. And he was here in studio again this morning, and we will probably see him many, many times. And it's like you said, it's good to know that the state of Israel has a true friend in Mike Huckabee. I think Mike Huckabee's been to Israel about 100 times already. And for him, this was like a dream posting, and we couldn't have had a better man be appointed ambassador from the United States to the state of Israel than Mike Huckabee.
Absolutely. At the same time, the United States continues, switching gears here, to strike the Houthis in Yemen. There were strikes over the weekend, U.S. military launching a series of airstrikes in the capital, Sana'a, and the Houthi-held coastal city of Hodeidah. This is after the U.S. several days ago led a major strike, wrecking a Red Sea port. 70 people were killed, including many Houthi terrorists there. So the U.S. continues to operate, attacking Yemen. At the same time, by the way, we are still getting ballistic missiles being launched at Israel by the Houthis. So they're not completely dismantled. They still have a viable ability to launch missiles at Israel. There were several, I believe, once or twice over the Passover holiday. That being said, the U.S. continues their attack on the Houthis.
Yeah, the only person that got to speak other than President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu in the Oval Office just over a week ago was Pete Hegseth. And the president wanted him to talk about the strikes in Yemen, and Hegseth did so enthusiastically. It's really, really important that terrorists and hijackers don't get away with their acts of terror. This is what Israel is doing against Hamas in Gaza, making sure that Hamas pays a price, and the United States now making sure that the Houthis pay a price. And for their destabilization of Yemen, destabilization of Saudi Arabia, the interruption of commercial shipping in one of the world's busiest international commercial waterways, ships going towards the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. But I think more importantly, and we've discussed this as well, the military strikes taking place inside Yemen, aside from just policing the Middle East and hurting at this terrorist organization, is to send a very, very strong message to the Iranians. If they think that the United States is going to balk with regard to the use of military force to get Iran to dismantle its own nuclear program or to have it dismantled for them, these strikes against the Houthis should be all that the Iranians need to know. This president is willing to use military force when necessary. And obviously the Houthis, they can still fire ballistic missiles at Israel, and they've been doing so, one or two at a time. It's not this, they don't have the same types of capabilities that Iran has because they're only one of the terror proxies. But you have to file off all these proxies. And this is the third of the three, Hamas, the three H's, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. But the message being delivered to Tehran that the United States is willing to use military force to accomplish its goals.
Speaking of that H, Hezbollah, the nation of Lebanon claims that its army is now replacing Hezbollah in the south. Take it for what it's worth. Lebanon's leadership declared in recent days the Lebanese army has began replacing Hezbollah forces. And on one hand, it's an achievement for Israel. You had Colonel in the reserves, Dr. Hanan Shai, telling JNS this week from the Mizgav Institute that this is unequivocally an achievement for Israel. But that being said, Shai warned, due to the weakness of the Lebanese army, the IDF cannot rely on it and must back it up with its own parallel defense. So some positive news, but you have to take it with a grain of salt, I think.
Trust but verify. I think it was Reagan who said that, certainly you don't want Hezbollah there. You want to transfer as much sovereign authority back to the Lebanese army, but you have to worry, who is the Lebanese army? Can Hezbollah simply infiltrate the Lebanese army? And just because the Lebanese army said it has taken over these sites doesn't mean that Israel can pull back from its strategic military points inside southern Lebanon, because Hezbollah could have also made a strategic decision to retreat, allow the Lebanese army to come in, hope that then Israel will retreat in kind and to pull back behind the Israeli border. And then as soon as Israel's no longer, the IDF's no longer in the country, that Hezbollah then just retakes those points, whether that's by agreement with the Lebanese army, whether that's through infiltration into the Lebanese army, where they're just dressed as Lebanese army, but they're ultimately Hezbollah, or whether they attack the Lebanese army and move them off those posts. These are all possibilities. And while Israel did significantly file down Hezbollah's capabilities to fire rockets, and particularly long-range missiles at Israel, and the estimates are anywhere from 60, 70, 75% of Hezbollah's missile capability, that still leaves a pretty significant missile capability. And you still have thousands upon thousands of Hezbollah operatives, many of them who have access to assault rifles that can still run amok in the country. So even though Israel has done a lot of damage to Hezbollah's capabilities, Israel didn't go all the way. Prime Minister Netanyahu calling a ceasefire months ago with Hezbollah before Hezbollah was completely removed as a potential military force and or political force. Remember, they're still part of the Lebanese parliament, which is something that needs to be taken care of as well. So, it's good news on the one hand, and Israel doesn't really want to go back to war in southern Lebanon. I mean, that's the assessment anyway, that the military leadership, political leadership doesn't want to go back to war in southern Lebanon. But at this point, it's trust but verify. Don't take any of these headlines at face value.
I spent some time over Passover hiking along the Israeli-Lebanese border. It was good that it was quiet. It was good that there were thousands of Israelis doing the same thing out and about, getting to places where we couldn't have up until recently. It's good to see Israelis back, but as you say, we have to be cautious. The fact that Hezbollah has not been completely dismantled, also infiltrating into the Lebanese army. A lot of brothers, literally, some Hezbollah, some in the Lebanese army, part of the same family. So we have to pay attention to the realities on the ground there. And finally, we have time for one more story here. The Shin Bet, we've talked about this over the last several weeks. Shin Bet head Ronen Bar, who was fired by Prime Minister Netanyahu. The case was in the Supreme Court. Apparently, he intends to hand in his resignation by mid-May. So in another 3 weeks or so, Ronen Bar might be stepping down from his position.
And you saw the prime minister try to fire Ronen Bar. And it's clear that there's no trust anymore between Netanyahu and Bar. Good questions as to what took the prime minister, 15, 16, 18 months since October 7th now, to fire Ronen Bar, when Ronen Bar has been revealed did not even wake the prime minister on the morning of October 7th. So clearly there was a lack of trust for this entire period between Netanyahu and Barr. And I guess the assessment is that Netanyahu wanted to keep the security establishment in place as long as the Biden administration was in office. But now it's been a few months, and Herzi Halevi, the chief of staff of the IDF, had handed in his resignation, and it was basically expected that Ronen Bar was going to do the same. And he announced his intention to hand in his resignation, but then started to place demands on what the process to replace him was going to be, basically suggesting that just like the Supreme Court justices, that Ronen Bar would have a say, even if not final approval, of who his successor would be at the head of Israel's internal intelligence agency. That's not something Netanyahu wanted to do. Of course, then Netanyahu put forward the candidacy of Eli Sharvit, who he had quickly had to pull back his candidacy over revelations that his planned successor had been part of the Kaplan Force anti-judicial reform protests, had tweeted against Donald Trump. And it makes you ask the question, like, who's running the hen house right now? I mean, it's so important for Netanyahu to get somebody in the head of the security agency that's going to report to him, and yet even the person that he was going to appoint as the replacement, he was forced to pull back that appointment because of revelations that should have been discovered before that appointment was ever announced. And so we don't know who yet Netanyahu is going to select as the head of the Shin Bet, but at least Ronen Bar seems like he's going to do the right thing, help Israel avoid some kind of constitutional crisis, because the Supreme Court put a temporary stay on the firing of Ronen Bar. So then it was kind of like unclear, how is Netanyahu going to react? And we've seen that Netanyahu has been hesitant to go against the ruling of the Supreme Court, which would create some kind of constitutional crisis in a country that doesn't have a constitution. And it's the last thing that Netanyahu wants. But here, Barr seemingly doing the right thing, and we don't really know what's behind the timed resignation. But Barr, taking responsibility, stepping out. We have to see what kind of statements he makes on the way out the door. He probably will call for Netanyahu to resign. We have to see who ends up being Ronen Bar's replacement and what the next stages of Netanyahu's war against his own deep state are going to look like in the weeks ahead.
We'll see how that all plays out, and we're nearly out of time. But Passover is now over, and it's extremely emotional, the time period we're headed towards now. We have Holocaust Remembrance and Martyrs Memorial Day this coming Wednesday night and Thursday. And then next week you have Israel's Memorial Day, followed by Independence Day. So it's very, very, if you haven't been to Israel and haven't experienced it, it's really the highs and the lows, everything that it means to be living here in the state of Israel and a member of the Jewish people, really, over the next 2 weeks or so. But first we have Holocaust Remembrance Day this coming Wednesday night and Thursday.
That's right. And we also have a week from today, Israel's inaugural JNS International Policy Summit taking place at the Waldorf Astoria.
Yes.
With the Prime Minister's attendance, with the attendance in the first public address of newly appointed U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, several other ministers, ambassadors from many countries, heads of think tanks, influencers, Knesset members, and others. It's going to be, I believe, an exciting milestone for JNS and an important step for the Jewish people as we try to provide a platform for building a new policy agenda for Israel and the Jewish people in the post-October 7th reality.
People who can't attend in person, how can they participate in the conference online, perhaps?
Yeah, plenary sessions will be live streamed, some of them, and all of the sessions will be recorded and put on the JNS YouTube channel in the days following the summit.
That's the 27th and 28th of April coming up, so do not miss out on the first annual JNS International Policy Summit. I want to give a shout out to the people behind the cameras here, Ryan Lifshitz, Zach Sickerman, Esther Eden, Timur David Aklin, and Yuri Svertsky. Thank you for your hard work. Make sure you go to JNS TV on YouTube to see all the amazing content coming out of this studio here, the Jerusalem JNS Media Hub, and go to jns.org for all the latest breaking news from Israel, the Middle East, and the entire Jewish world. Josh Hasten here, correspondent for JNS, along with Alex Traiman, CEO of JNS. Have a great week, everybody. All the best from Jerusalem.